Commission for Gender Equality has released a report into the state of shelters for victims of violence. It looked into the functioning of these shelters and the challenges faced by women and children who stay there. Now, for more on the story, we're joined now by eNCA reporter Janke Tolmay. Janke, you were telling me that this report was released, in fact, just a little earlier this morning. This is such an important issue, just the state of the functions, the state of the shelters that women and children who are faced with violence do go to. You'll take us through, no doubt, some of the findings of this report.
Yes, Michelle, such as you mentioned, an important report, just because if you think about the levels of gender-based violence in South Africa and just the recourse that some of these women face, and the only place that they often have to go to, can go to, are these shelters that you find across the country. Now, what the Commission did is they looked at three randomly selected shelters per province across the country, just to get a sense of the state of these shelters, whether they can function adequately, and whether these the victims of the GBV specifically have a place where they can stay safely and find some comfort after going through what they have to go through. Now, I do have here with me Commissioner Maleko, who released the report this morning. Just going to take us through some of the key concerns, and it seems like the major one is funding, or the lack thereof, when it comes to shelters. And I thank you, Commissioner, for joining me. As I've mentioned, the key concern highlighted by the Commission is when it comes to the lack of funding. And just give us some background and some of the findings relating to this. And if you could just maybe explain also that this does not just mean 100% funded by government, but all across the board, partially funded and private institutions.
Absolutely. This was a core issue across the provinces. We looked at all provinces. We looked at each partially funded, fully funded, and also not funded by the Department of Social Development. So we found across the board that all shelters in South Africa are really crying out for funding, particularly those that are funded by the Department of Social Development. Some of the findings were that timing of payments was not necessarily timeous. Some were paid at intermittent times during the year, putting severe pressure on capabilities of doing the work that is required. We also found that minimum standards for infrastructure across the shelters was not the same. So you'd find that some shelters are highly staffed, have adequate equipment, others are in containers in different parts. And particularly the change in the trends of funding. There seemed to be no systemic funding model that the department uses. We therefore recommend that one should looking at the needs of the centres provincially and regionally, and allocating sufficient budget according to the needs of the shelters accordingly, and not only funding according to a fixed model that doesn't look at the changing needs of the shelters in that region.
Now, some of these fundings are quite concerning, given what South Africa faces when it comes to the levels of GBV, and the fact that a lot of these women, a lot of times they do have children with them, do not have any other place to go.
Absolutely. A concern in one of the shelters, we found that male children over a certain age are not allowed in. Imagine you are running from a perpetrator that is trying to kill you. Remember the context of South Africa. Let me take you to that. We have 5 times higher than the global average of femicide. We have the highest incidence of rape in the world. We have glaringly high numbers of protection orders, over 250,000 are reported per annum. And there's a list of framework or indicators that I could refer you to in terms of the glaring problem that we have of gender-based violence. So we're seeing that across the board, the requirements and the needs on the ground are not met on a budgetary level. I think from a policy perspective, we're saying we need clear gender budgeting framework or indicators and budget allocations specifically targeted to deal with the issue and the problem of gender-based violence, not only with shelters, with the justice cluster, with policing, with support mechanisms around the issue of GBV, so that we can actually quell this. We've also said that on a skills development perspective, women's empowerment becomes critical, because perpetrators stay with abusers because they have no option because of financial reliance. And we are saying as CGE, look at ways to partner shelters with SETAs, with training service providers, and with other education institutions that the government, or training management or training institutions, which the government is already funding. So we're not saying duplicate roles and responsibilities, but rather be more efficient in allocation of funding, but also the services that are offered by the different tiers of government. We must use those efficiently, and I think we can do that.
And now, just lastly, just take us through some of your recommendations that you highlight in the report. It seems like a lot of hearings and more investigation will still need to be done going forward.
So this was a preliminary stage investigation. It was a first finding, but I think that what we're interested in, it's a parallel process of some implementation. So 3 things. Clear standard indicators that are required as a minimum requirement for each shelter. That can be done within 3 to 6 months. That we've said must happen. No discrimination in shelters. That must take place. We are saying that can happen now. I think on a medium-term perspective, we haven't looked at all shelters in South Africa because of our own resource constraint. But we're able now to say to the Department of Social Development, give us the whole population. We've taken a sample. We now want to look at the entire population. We're calling the HODs or the DGs for human settlements and also for social development, to say how can we improve these indices, what monitoring framework can we put in place, and how do we standardize some of the issues that we have picked up and improve on those, so that we can see better outcomes and better support. Because we're talking about a woman who's been abused, we're talking about someone who's running from a violent partner, we're talking about someone who's really frail, in need of support, therapy, counseling, and we're saying that we must do better for our abused.
Thank you very much. There you go, Michelle. Just a quick summary by Commissioner Moleko on extremely important issues, specifically in South Africa as a country. As she mentioned, high levels of GBV, and as she mentioned, this is just the first leg of the investigation. So a lot of work still needs to be done, but definitely important first steps that has been taken.
Yeah, absolutely, and such an important conversation there between Janke Tolmay and Nthabiseng Moleko from the Commission for Gender Equality.